$13,000 bounced check. I mean, for a massive multinational corporation, it's literally a rounding error.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Like, it wouldn't even warrant a footnote on a quarterly financial report. But for a young, scrappy company trying to, gain a foothold in the market, it is the difference between making payroll and just permanently closing your doors.
That's life or death.
Exactly. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're dissecting the hidden and honestly often agonizing tensions of the ultimate organizational balancing act, the CEO role.
Yeah, we're pulling insights from Joel Trammell's work on mastering this executive tightrope. But our mission goes way beyond just like understanding the view from the corner office.
Right, because whether you are a newly minted manager trying to run a 5-person team or, a seasoned executive overseeing thousands, the structural pressures of leadership are actually identical.
They really are.
So we're going to extract the actionable mechanisms that you need to navigate the chaos of running any team. Starting with the exact nightmare scenario that $13,000 bounce check represents. Okay. Let's unpack this.
Well, that bounce check is like the perfect catalyst for this whole discussion because it completely crystallizes the fundamental paradox of leadership, which is this brutal tension between responsibility and control.
Yeah.
The executive in that scenario shipped a massive order of computers, accepted a business check to, facilitate the client's timeline, and then the client just skipped town.
Wow.
Right. And the executive wasn't in the room when the check bounced. They couldn't magically reach across state lines and force the funds to clear. They had absolutely zero direct control over the outcome.
Zero. But they bore 100% of the responsibility for the financial devastation it caused to their company.
Exactly.
And that gap, the vast distance between what you can physically control and what you are ultimately responsible for, that is the defining psychological weight of leadership.
It is. And it's terrifying when you actually stop and map it out. You're on the hook for the collective output of hundreds of autonomous human beings.
There is a legendary illustration of this exact dynamic from the U.S. Navy. So a highly decorated senior officer gets promoted to command an entire submarine group in the Pacific.
Okay.
And we are talking about overarching strategic command of 8 different nuclear submarines. But just 2 weeks into his tenure, 2 weeks, one of the submarines in his group runs aground.
Oh, man. And the entire strategic value of a sub is that it's supposed to be invisible.
Right. Running aground turns it into a stationary, highly visible target. It's a catastrophic failure of navigation and protocol.
So what happened to the commander?
Well, the fallout from that event is an absolute masterclass in accountability. The commanding officer of that specific submarine is instantly relieved of duty.
Which, that makes logical sense to most people. He was on the boat, right? He was the final authority in that metal tube.
Exactly. But the accountability doesn't stop there. The group commander, the guy who had only held his position for 2 weeks, who was sitting at a desk thousands of miles away.
Who probably they hadn't even met the commander of that specific submarine yet.
Yep. He receives a permanent career-ending reprimand.
Wow.
He never receives another promotion. He is quietly forced into retirement. Because the military doctrine is absolute, you are responsible for every aspect of the performance of your organization, regardless of your physical proximity to the failure.
See, living in that permanent state of high responsibility and low control is what breaks people. It pushes leaders into 2 distinct, highly destructive failure modes.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is the total control leader. This is the executive who is so paralyzed by the fear of that accountability gap that they try to artificially shrink it by micromanaging every single molecule of the company.
Oh, the classic Theory X management style from the 60s.
Exactly. It's this underlying paranoid assumption that employees are inherently unmotivated, lazy, and will just actively sabotage the operation unless they're constantly monitored and threatened.
Right. And the visual metaphor often used here is like a farmer trailing behind a mule with a whip. If the mule slows down, whip it. If it strays an inch off the path, whip it.
Yeah, and in a corporate environment, this manifests as the CEO who insists on personally approving the font choices on the marketing team's business cards.
Yes. Or the manager who demands a daily spreadsheet detailing how their developers spent every 15-minute increment of their day.
Right. They suffocate the organization because they just refuse to accept that scaling a business requires relinquishing direct tactile control.
But then you have the complete opposite end of the spectrum, which is arguably just as dangerous.
The master strategist?
Yes,
Yeah.
the leader who swings so far away from being a micromanager that they completely detach from the operational reality of the business, they retreat to the ivory tower.
Convinced that their sole purpose is to formulate brilliant, overarching visions.
Right, they draft these massive, complex strategic roadmaps, hand them down to the frontline workers, and then just wash their hands of the execution.
And when the execution inevitably fails, because, the strategy completely ignored the boots-on-the-ground reality, the master strategist never blames their own plan.
Of course not. They blame the team for failing to grasp their sheer strategic brilliance.
It is the equivalent of loading a wooden cart with 2 tons of solid iron, hitching it to a single donkey, and then standing back and yelling at the donkey when the cart tips backward and suspends the poor animal 6 feet in the air.
That is such a vivid image, and both the micromanager and the master strategist fail because they fundamentally misunderstand the required skill set for the top job.
Yeah. Bill Gates famously noted that success is a lousy teacher because it seduces smart people into thinking they can't lose.
Right, because most executives reach the top because they were brilliant functional experts. They were the best VP of sales or like the sharpest chief financial officer.
But running an entire organization requires making nuanced, balanced decisions across disciplines where they possess zero functional expertise.
Which means the skill that got them the promotion is totally useless in the new role. It makes me think of the dynamic between a jockey and a thoroughbred racehorse.
Oh, I like that. How so?
Well, the jockey is sitting on top of a 1,000-pound animal moving at 40 miles an hour. The jockey cannot physically carry the horse across the finish line, right?
No, obviously not.
They cannot muscle the animal into running faster. They have surrendered total physical control, but they possess immense critical influence.
Right. They suddenly shift their center of gravity. They read the field. They guide the animal into the optimal position to utilize its own raw power.
Exactly. That is the true essence of executive leadership. You aren't doing the running. You are shaping the conditions for the run.
That is a phenomenal framework for understanding the transition. Because when you strip away the illusion of direct physical control, you are left with a single operational mechanism, and that's influence.
You have to convince the person holding the steering wheel to turn it in the right direction.
Right. And influence isn't some mystical aura. It is a highly specific currency built on a deeply fragile foundation. It requires the constant maintenance of 3 specific pillars: credibility, competence, and caring.
The 3 C's. Let's examine the mechanics of those pillars, starting with credibility. What makes credibility so terrifying for a leader is that it is strictly binary.
Yeah, you have it or you don't.
You cannot be credible 95% of the time. If you lie to your team 5% of the time, your credibility drops to 0.
A single lapse, even a seemingly minor one, can instantly vaporize a leader's ability to influence an organization.
And the story of Scott Thompson at Yahoo is the definitive case study on the binary nature of credibility.
Oh, man. Yeah, in early 2012, Yahoo was a chaotic environment. The board desperately needed a stabilizing force, so they brought in Scott Thompson.
And he had just come off a wildly successful run as the president of PayPal, right?
Exactly. On paper, and in terms of raw industry experience, he was a massive get for Yahoo. He had the pedigree.
But the environment at Yahoo included Dan Loeb, an incredibly aggressive activist investor who was already frustrated with the board and highly skeptical of Thompson's appointment.
And activist investors specialize in leverage. So Loeb started digging into Thompson's background, looking for any point of weakness.
And he found it in an SEC filing. He sent a public letter to the Yahoo board pointing out that Thompson's official biography claimed he held a bachelor's degree in both accounting and computer science from Stonehill College.
But Loeb revealed that Thompson only had an accounting degree. Stonehill didn't even offer a computer science degree until 4 years after Thompson graduated.
The fallout was instantaneous and lethal. Now, did Thompson need a computer science degree to run Yahoo?
No, of course not. He had already proven his technological leadership at PayPal. And honestly, there was never any definitive proof that Thompson personally typed that fake degree into his own bio.
Right, it could have been an administrative error years prior that just got copied and pasted into perpetuity.
But the internet sleuth immediately unearthed a recent audio interview where a journalist explicitly asked Thompson about his computer science background, and Thompson answered the question without correcting the premise.
Oh, wow. So he allowed the fiction to stand.
He did. And because credibility is binary, his influence evaporated overnight. He was forced to resign just days after the scandal broke.
The board didn't fire him because he couldn't do the job. They fired him because you cannot ask 10,000 engineers to follow a vision laid out by a man they fundamentally do not trust.
It is the ultimate cautionary tale about owning your own narrative.
I actually recall a story about an executive who, early in his career, was reviewing a bio drafted for a speaking engagement. The PR team had spiced it up, claiming he had served in executive positions.
Let me guess, he wasn't an executive yet.
Nope, he was just a mid-level IT manager at the time, but it is so tempting to just let a flattering exaggeration slide. Like, who's gonna check, right?
Right. But if you don't aggressively correct the lie, you are adopting it, which perfectly transitions into the second pillar, competence.
Okay, so credibility is honesty. What's competence?
Well, you can possess absolute, unimpeachable credibility. You could be the most honest person in the boardroom. But if the rank and file believe you do not deeply understand the mechanics of the business, they will not execute your strategy.
So competence requires proving that you understand how the product is built, how the supply chain functions, and critically, how the internal culture operates.
Yes. And ignoring the internal culture is the fastest way to signal deep incompetence. Look at Leo Apotheker's disastrous tenure at Hewlett-Packard.
Oh, HP. Their foundational DNA is hardware. They are the legendary Silicon Valley engineering firm built on printers, servers, and physical machines.
Right. But in 2010, the board ousted Mark Hurd and brought in Apotheker. Now, Apotheker had spent 2 decades at SAP, which is a massive German enterprise software company.
So he had zero background in consumer hardware.
Exactly. And a profound disconnect from the specific hardware-centric engineering culture of Silicon Valley. The organizational tissue rejection was almost immediate.
Because he attempted to pivot this massive hardware battleship into a software and services company.
Yeah, but the defining moment of his incompetence in the eyes of the workforce was the HP touchpad.
Right. HP had acquired Palm to build their own operating system, and they launched the touchpad as a direct competitor to the Apple iPad.
And it was heavily hyped internally. The engineers poured immense time and resources into it.
And just 7 weeks after the launch, 7 weeks, when initial sales numbers came in soft, Apotheker panicked.
He didn't iterate, he didn't adjust the marketing. He simply killed the entire product line in a public announcement.
Imagine being an engineer who sacrificed weekends for 2 years to build that hardware, only to watch the CEO abandon it before the market even had a chance to digest it.
It signaled to the entire company that the leader had no stomach for the hardware business. The engineers revolted internally. Apotheker lost the company and was fired less than a year into his tenure.
He failed the competence test by fundamentally misunderstanding the timeline and resilience required in hardware development.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most difficult pillar, to fake caring.
Now, in the context of executive leadership, caring does not mean being everyone's therapist or best friend, right?
Right, it's a highly specific operational metric. Caring means consistently demonstrating, through resource allocation and personal behavior, that you prioritize the health of the organization over your own personal enrichment.
And when an executive violates the caring pillar, it usually manifests in grotesque displays of corporate looting. The definitive example here is Dennis Kozlowski, the former CEO of Tyco.
Oh, the Roman orgy story.
Yes. Kozlowski threw an infamous 40th birthday party for his wife on the Italian island of Sardinia. It was a multi-day Roman orgy-themed extravaganza that cost over $2 million.
It's just wild.
They had a private performance by Jimmy Buffett, gladiators serving food, and get this, a legendary ice sculpture of Michelangelo's David that was plumbed to urinate premium vodka into crystal glasses.
Okay, the extravagance itself is distasteful, but the fatal violation of the caring pillar occurred when the billing was uncovered. Kozlowski expensed half the cost of this Roman bacchanal, over $1 million, directly to Tyco.
Wait, he billed the company?
Yes, by disguising it in the accounting ledger as a corporate shareholder meeting.
A shareholder meeting featuring a vodka-peeing ice sculpture. You truly cannot write better satire.
No, you can't. But the underlying reality is incredibly dark for the workforce. Tyco was actually performing decently well at the time. The stock was moving.
But imagine being a middle manager at Tyco, working 60-hour weeks, fighting for a 3% cost of living raise for your team, and then discovering the CEO is using the company treasury as his personal piggy bank for Italian vacations.
It instantly destroys any intrinsic motivation to work hard. It signals that your labor is nothing more than fuel for the executive's lavish lifestyle.
And that is exactly why Kozlowski ended up in prison for fraud. But let's invert this and examine someone who utilized these three pillars to exert almost unparalleled influence: Steve Jobs.
Jobs is a fascinating case study because his reputation was built on his abrasive, demanding, and often volcanic temper. He was not a traditionally caring manager in the emotional sense.
So how did he command such fierce, unwavering loyalty from the top engineering talent in the world? People who could have easily walked across the street to Google or Microsoft on any given Tuesday.
Because influence isn't about being nice. What's fascinating here is how Jobs' influence was anchored in a profound, almost aggressive adherence to the three C's.
Right. When he stood on a stage and said Apple was going to dent the universe, his credibility was absolute. He wasn't giving corporate lip service. His passion was authentic down to his marrow.
And his competence was unquestionable because his obsessive perfectionism regarding product design proved to the engineers that he understood exactly what it took to build something flawless. He spoke their language.
And his execution of the caring pillar was highly strategic.
Yet during his first stint at Apple, he actually failed this pillar. He was so obsessed with the Macintosh team that he actively disparaged the Apple II team, fracturing the company and leading to his ouster.
But when he returned in 1997 to save Apple from the brink of bankruptcy, he demonstrated profound institutional care by taking a salary of exactly $1 a year.
Right. He tied his massive wealth entirely to the stock. He signaled to every employee in the building, "I am not here to drain the remaining cash reserves. I am here to save the tribe, and my financial fate is identical to yours."
That structural alignment is incredibly powerful, but analyzing Jobs brings up a serious operational debate. We established that credibility requires absolute honesty, but is absolute transparency always a virtue?
What do you mean?
Well, if a leader looks at the cash flow projections and realizes the company might miss payroll in 3 months, do you really want to drop that bomb on the frontline workers? Doesn't a leader have a duty to act as a heat shield, absorbing that existential terror so the developers and the sales team can actually focus on their jobs without panicking?
It is a natural instinct to want to protect your team. But shielding them from the core reality of the business is a fundamental failure of leadership.
Why is that?
It infantilizes the workforce.
Yeah.
If your employees do not understand the brutal financial realities the company is facing, how can you possibly expect them to make autonomous, localized decisions that actually help navigate the crisis?
Ah, I see. If they think cash is abundant, they will spend it.
Exactly. Transparency is the prerequisite for alignment, and maintaining that connection to reality requires a leader to be intensely deliberate about how they allocate their own cognitive bandwidth.
Which brings us to the micro level of leadership time management and role switching. The framework here is the concept of the 6 hats.
These are distinct operational modes that a leader must actively cycle through. If you fail to consciously manage which hat you are wearing, you inevitably default to the tasks you find most comfortable.
Creating massive blind spots in the organization.
Right. The most common failure mode here is the super VP.
This is the executive who is promoted from a highly successful stint as the VP of sales, right?
Yeah. And even though they are now the CEO, responsible for the entire ecosystem, they spend 80% of their week hovering over the sales floor, dissecting the pipeline and trying to close deals.
They ignore HR, they neglect the engineering roadmap, and they treat the finance department like an annoyance. They are essentially a highly paid VP of sales masquerading as a CEO.
Leaving the rest of the company rudderless. To avoid becoming the super VP, you have to force yourself into the rotation.
So what are the hats?
The first hat is the player. This is acting as a direct individual contributor. Now, if your company has scaled past 50 people, you should rarely wear this hat. You hire experts to do the work.
But there are strategic moments where stepping onto the field is necessary for morale. There is a great industry story about a CEO whose company sent custom holiday candy boxes to thousands of clients.
Oh, I know this one. As they grew, fulfilling this order became a logistical nightmare for the shipping department.
Right. Instead of just commanding them to work faster, the CEO went down to the loading dock and spent hours taping up boxes alongside the frontline workers.
The psychological signaling of that action is massive. It proves that no work is beneath the executive layer.
Okay, so that's the player. What's the second hat?
The second hat is the coach. This is entirely distinct from the player. The coach does not do the work. The coach spends dedicated one-on-one time with direct reports, focusing exclusively on talent development, identifying skill gaps, and removing roadblocks.
And the third hat is the architect. This is the purely strategic function. It requires stepping away from the daily noise to ask existential questions.
Like, are we in the right market? How is our competitor's new patent going to affect our supply chain in 2 years?
Exactly. The fourth hat is the engineer. Where the architect focuses on strategy, the engineer focuses on internal process.
It is about building and refining the systems that allow the business to scale without breaking. It's looking at the onboarding flow for new hires or the QA process for the software and finding the friction points.
The fifth hat is the learner. Because a leader operating in a vacuum is a liability. You have to actively seek out external data. You have to read outside your industry, attend conferences, and talk to customers who hate your product.
And the final hat is the priest. This is arguably the most nuanced and dangerous role.
The priest. How so?
Wearing the priest hat means making yourself available to hear confessions. It requires walking the floor, engaging in unstructured conversations, and listening to the raw, unvarnished frustrations, personal struggles, and interpersonal conflicts of your staff.
It is how you gauge the true emotional temperature of the building.
But the danger lies in the execution. When an employee comes to you, vents about a broken process, and blames their manager, your immediate executive instinct is to fix it. You want to be the hero who cuts through the red tape.
Oh, I see. But if you solve the problem for them, you have just initiated a catastrophic chain reaction.
Exactly. If you bypass the middle manager to fulfill the employee's request, you have explicitly taught that employee that their manager is powerless. You have neutered the manager's authority in front of their team.
So think about the troops eat first mentality. Packing holiday candy boxes alongside the team is wearing the player hat, but it's really a secret way of wearing the priest hat to boost morale without undermining anyone.
Right. The proper function of the priest hat is to listen, absorb the diagnostic data about where the company is hurting, and then subtly coach the employee on how to communicate effectively with their own manager to resolve the issue.
It is an exercise in extreme restraint, and balancing these six hats requires immense discipline. Jack Dorsey provided a fascinating extreme example of this when he was simultaneously serving as the CEO of both Twitter and Square.
Oh yeah, his thematic schedule. To prevent his cognitive load from collapsing, he utilized a rigid schedule to force context switching.
Right. Mondays were strictly dedicated to management and executive committee meetings. Tuesdays were entirely focused on product, engineering, and design.
Wednesdays were for marketing, communications, and growth. Thursdays were for external partnerships and developers.
And Fridays were dedicated to company culture and recruiting. By artificially constraining his focus, he ensured that neither company and no specific department was starved of executive attention.
That level of microscopic time management is fascinating, but it only solves the internal chaos of the leader. How do you scale that alignment?
Right. How do you get 500 people spread across different time zones and departments to make the right decisions when you aren't in the room?
That requires transitioning from the micro level of time management to the macro level of owning the vision. And owning the vision does not mean drafting a generic, jargon-filled mission statement and ignoring it. It must be a visceral, active compass.
Like when Joel Trammell founded NetQS. He didn't just tell his team they were a network management company. He defined their vision as becoming the ultimate network performance experts.
And to make that concept stick in the minds of his engineers, he used a pop culture anchor. He would show them clips from the old John Wayne movie Hellfighters.
Oh, based on the life of Red Adair, the legendary specialist who extinguished massive, uncontrollable oil well fire.
Yes, the analogy was brilliant. He told his team, when an oil company has a minor leak, they call a plumber. When an oil rig explodes and creates a towering inferno that threatens to destroy the entire facility, they call Red Adair.
He positioned NetQS as the Red Adair of corporate networks. When a Fortune 500 company's entire infrastructure is melting down, they don't call a generic IT guy, they call us.
It gave the employees a distinct, swaggering identity that informed how they built the software and how they talked to clients.
But a powerful vision is utterly useless if the intent behind the vision is lost as it cascades down the organizational chart.
Right. And there is a story regarding a hotel in Las Vegas that perfectly illustrates the mechanics of this alignment failure.
Yes. So a CEO had booked a block of 30 rooms at a smaller off-strip hotel for a massive upcoming corporate conference. His team had negotiated a heavily discounted group rate of $129 a night.
However, the CEO's travel schedule shifted, and he decided to fly in one day early.
He walks into the lobby, approaches the front desk, and explains the situation. He says, "I'm the head of the group checking in tomorrow. I know I'm early, but do you have a room available for tonight?
And the desk clerk is perfectly polite, checks the system, and says, "Yes, sir, we have plenty of availability. The rate for tonight is $199.
The CEO responds logically. He says, I understand that's the rack rate, but I'm bringing 30 rooms of business to this hotel tomorrow under our negotiated $129 rate. Could you simply extend that group rate for my single room tonight?
The clerk flatly refuses.
Oh.
She recites the hotel policy because he did not secure a reservation for that specific night in advance. He must pay the walk-up rate.
The CEO gently pushes back, reminding her of the massive revenue his group is bringing to the property. He asks for a manager.
And the clerk looks at him and says, "I am the manager on duty."
So the CEO turns around, walks out the door, and books a room at a competing hotel down the street.
Now, the instinctive reaction to this story is to blame the clerk. We naturally assume she is just a rigid, terrible employee devoid of common sense.
But if you analyze the structural mechanics of the interaction, this is not a customer service failure. It is a catastrophic failure of executive alignment.
Exactly. That clerk was almost certainly executing her training to the letter. Imagine the chain of command. The general manager of that hotel looks at the quarterly projections and realizes they are behind.
The GM holds a staff meeting and sets a new objective. We need to aggressively increase our average daily room revenue.
That is a completely rational strategic intent. But as that objective is handed down to the shift managers and then to the front desk staff, the intent is stripped away. It is reduced to a rigid, context-free policy. Do not offer discounts to walk-in customers under any circumstances.
So the clerk obeys the policy. She protects the $199 rate. But in doing so, she deeply insults the CEO of a company that just purchased 30 rooms, essentially guaranteeing they will take their annual conference to a different hotel next year.
By adhering strictly to the letter of the policy, she actively destroyed the original intent of the policy, which was to maximize long-term hotel revenue.
This dynamic is exactly what the legendary military theorist Carl von Clausewitz defined as friction.
Friction is the inevitable, chaotic gap between a strategic plan and the actual physical execution of that plan. It is the gap between what you want to happen and what reality allows to happen.
And when executives attempt to eliminate friction by creating massive, hundreds of pages long employee handbooks detailing exactly how to handle every conceivable human interaction, they actually maximize internal friction.
Because the moment reality deviates from the handbook, the employee is paralyzed.
The antidote to that friction is a concept called directed opportunism. Instead of giving your team a micromanaged instruction manual, you arm them with absolute clarity regarding the overriding intent.
You tell them what the ultimate goal is and why it matters, and then you grant them the autonomy to figure out the how in real time.
If that Vegas desk clerk truly understood that the overarching intent of the hotel was to cultivate highly profitable, recurring relationships with corporate clients, she would have comped the CEO's room entirely, let alone matched the $129 rate.
But directed opportunism cannot exist in a vacuum. It requires a massive flow of contextual information. Leaders who operate like secret agents, hoarding financial data, hiding the strategic roadmap, treating basic company metrics like classified state secrets, make directed opportunism impossible.
If your employees don't know the profit margins, they don't know the burn rate, and they don't know the strategic threats, they cannot possibly act opportunistically to help you. They are flying blind.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The way a leader communicates reality, especially financial reality, dictates the emotional resilience of the entire company.
Right. So if you surveyed your team right now, would their definition of success match yours? Or are they operating on a completely different set of rules?
That's the million-dollar question. Because when you shift from defining the vision to actually funding it and reporting on progress, leaders tend to fracture into two extreme communication styles, the cheerleader and the Eeyore.
The cheerleader is pathologically optimistic. They are terrified that admitting weakness will cause a mass exodus of talent.
There's a vivid anecdote about encountering a startup CEO at a networking event who spent 30 minutes aggressively hyping his company, claiming growth was explosive, and they were on the verge of dominating the sector.
And the very next day, a mid-level employee of that exact same startup reveals over lunch that they just missed their quarterly revenue target by 30%.
In the startup world, a 30% miss is not a minor deviation. It is an existential threat that usually precedes massive layoffs.
So the cheerleader CEO was either entirely disconnected from his own financials, or he was actively lying because he was stuck in campaign mode.
But the workforce is not blind. They see the empty sales pipeline. They see the stalled code deployments. When a leader constantly insists everything is flawless while the ship is actively taking on water, it destroys the high performer's trust.
And then you have the Eeyore, which creates a different kind of rot. The Eeyore views every victory as a trap.
If the sales team lands the biggest contract in company history, the Eeyore refuses to celebrate. They immediately say, don't pop the champagne until the invoice clears, and frankly, your pipeline for next quarter looks dangerously thin.
They believe that fear is the only reliable motivator. Working for an Eeyore creates an environment of chronic anxiety. Employees stop sharing good news because it will be met with cynical dismissal, and they actively hide bad news because they are terrified of the disproportionate reaction.
The optimal state is what we call paranoid optimism. It borrows heavily from the philosophy of legendary basketball coach Bob Knight, who argued that hyper-awareness of negative outcomes is the best mechanism for ensuring positive results. His mantra was, planning beats repairing.
A paranoid optimist operates as the emotional shock absorber for the organization. When the company is hitting record profits and the team is becoming arrogant and complacent, the leader grounds them by pointing to a new emerging competitor or a shifting macroeconomic headwind.
And conversely, when the company just lost a massive client, the market is crashing and the team is demoralized, the leader absorbs that panic and projects absolute unshakable confidence in the long-term viability of the vision.
You counterbalance the natural emotional drift of the organization, but managing emotions is light work compared to the brutal mechanics of capital allocation.
Oh, for sure. The tension between demanding aggressive growth and maintaining operational profitability is the daily migraine of executive leadership.
To illustrate the mechanics of this tension, consider this operational dilemma. It is late Friday afternoon. The director of software development walks into the CEO's office.
Okay, setting the scene.
He explains that the team is finalizing a massive new product update, but to ensure it doesn't crash the client's servers upon deployment, they desperately need to purchase a specialized simulated testing chassis.
Sounds important.
The cost is $125,000. It is an unbudgeted expense, but it is directly tied to product quality and future top-line growth. The CEO promises to review the request.
And then what happens?
10 minutes later, the chief financial officer walks in. The CFO says, "We are growing so rapidly that our legacy accounting software is physically breaking down. We cannot accurately track revenue recognition, and the auditing process is a nightmare. We need an immediate system upgrade, and the implementation cost is exactly $125,000.
Wow. This is the purest distillation of executive resource allocation. You have finite capital. You have two identical financial requests.
Yep. One request, the testing chassis, is an offensive move designed to drive future growth and capture market share.
And the other request, the accounting system, is a defensive move designed to shore up operational efficiency and protect the bottom line. How do you mathematically evaluate which constraint is more dangerous to the business?
To navigate this, the financial sector utilizes a highly effective heuristic known as the Rule of 45.
The premise is simple but profound. For a company to achieve an exceptional premium valuation in the market, its annual revenue growth rate plus its operating profit margin should equal or exceed 45%.
It creates a sliding scale that balances growth and efficiency.
Let's break down the math of how this actually dictates daily operations. If your company is a hyper-growth startup expanding its revenue by 45% a year, the market will allow you to run at a 0% operating margin.
You can essentially operate at break-even, burning all your cash to acquire customers, and you will still be considered a premium asset.
However, if you are a mature legacy manufacturing firm whose growth has slowed to just 5% a year, you need to operate with ruthless efficiency. You must generate a massive 40% operating margin to hit the Rule of 45 and maintain your valuation.
But wait, let's look at the anomalies. Look at Amazon in the 2000s, or Twitter before it went private, or Uber. These companies bled billions of dollars for over a decade.
They did.
They had massive negative operating margins, and they certainly weren't hitting a positive 45% combined metric. The market rewarded them with trillion-dollar valuations anyway. Does the Rule of 45 actually apply to modern tech monopolies, or is it an outdated industrial metric?
It is a critical distinction, and it comes down to the underlying unit economics of the business. There is a profound difference between a strategic, capital-intensive land grab and terminal death by growth.
Explain that difference.
Amazon operated at a massive loss because they were actively choosing to reinvest every single penny of gross profit into building a globally dominant logistics infrastructure. Their core business of selling a book or a server instance was highly profitable on a unit level. They were buying the future.
Ah, contrast that with the Groupon IPO disaster. Groupon was experiencing unprecedented, explosive top-line revenue growth, but their unit economics were inverted.
The cost to acquire a customer, combined with the massive discounts they were offering, meant they were essentially losing money on every single transaction.
It is the old joke, we lose money on every sale, but we make it up in volume.
Right, when your underlying unit economics are negative, aggressive growth doesn't lead to dominance, it just accelerates your bleeding. Death by growth.
The Rule of 45 forces leaders to honestly evaluate if their lack of profitability is a strategic choice or a structural flaw.
And how a leader interprets that financial reality dictates their relationship with the budget. You see the emergence of the budget tyrant.
This is the manager who treats the annual budget as an inflexible, sacred document. If a brilliant, highly profitable opportunity arises in October, but it wasn't forecasted the previous December, the budget tyrant refuses to fund it.
They paralyze the company's agility to protect a spreadsheet.
There's a maddening example of this. An executive realized his department was utilizing a third-party vendor for basic IT help desk support, paying an effective rate of $75 an hour per contractor.
Okay, that's pretty standard.
He ran the numbers and realized he could hire full-time internal employees to do the exact same work for an all-in cost, including benefits of roughly $25 an hour. It would save the company millions of dollars annually. He takes his proposal to the department director.
And the director rejects it. Because the $75 an hour contractor fees are categorized under the services budget, which is already approved, hiring full-time staff requires adding headcount, which triggers a massive bureaucratic approval process.
Oh, man.
Furthermore, the director knows that if he reduces his services budget this year, finance will permanently cut his budget for next year. So to protect his own departmental fiefdom, he actively chooses to waste millions of corporate dollars. It is institutionalized insanity.
On the opposite end, you have the budget blower, the executive who views capital as an infinite resource to fund their ego. HP's acquisition of autonomy is the textbook example.
HP spent over $11 billion to acquire the software company, a staggering multiple of its actual revenue. It was a panicked, structurally irrational shopping spree that resulted in HP having to take a nearly $9 billion write-down shortly after.
So, navigating between the tyrant and the blower, how did the CEO handle the two $125,000 requests from earlier?
He ran a brilliant operational stress test. He didn't say no. He went back to the director of software development and the CFO, and he said, I agree that both of these projects are important. You are authorized to spend the $125,000.
But
However, you cannot have new capital. You must find the money by cutting $125,000 from your own existing departmental budgets. You prioritize what matters.
And predictably, both leaders immediately balked. They claimed there was absolutely no fat to trim in their budgets.
By forcing the middle managers to make the localized trade-off, the CEO proved that neither request was an existential priority. They were nice-to-haves, masquerading as crises.
Because they refused to reallocate their own funds, he denied both requests until the company's natural cash flow could easily absorb them.
It is a phenomenal mechanism for uncovering true priorities. But you can possess a masterfully balanced budget, a pristine strategy, and absolute market clarity, and it will all collapse into dust if you do not have the right humans executing the work.
The highest leverage activity of any executive is the acquisition and deployment of talent. There is a quote from Spike Dykes, the legendary Texas Tech football coach, that radically resets how we should view talent.
He was asked to break down the formula for winning, right?
Yeah. How much of a championship is brilliant play calling and coaching, and how much is just having superior athletes? Dykes didn't hesitate. He said it is 75% the players and 25% the coaching.
That is a staggering admission of limits from a master tactician.
He admitted that if you give him a roster of truly elite athletes and a completely average coach, they will obliterate a brilliant coach who is saddled with average players every single time.
And the corporate translation is identical.
Yeah.
You cannot out-strategize a fundamentally mediocre workforce. Charles Koch, who built Koch Industries into a massive conglomerate, utilized a ruthless statistical grading scale to categorize this talent pool into A, B, and C players.
Let's define the math on those categories, because A player is thrown around constantly on LinkedIn as a generic compliment, but it has a specific statistical definition.
An A player is an individual who consistently performs in the top 15% of all human beings in your specific industry executing that specific role. They are the apex predators of productivity.
They possess a disproportionate impact on the company's trajectory. A B player falls in the next tier, roughly the top 15 to 50%. They are highly reliable, structurally necessary, and form the backbone of the daily operation.
And then you have the C players, who make up the bottom 50% of the talent pool. A C player is not just neutral. They are actively value destructive.
They require disproportionate management time, they demoralize the A players who have to cover their mistakes, and they put the organization at a distinct competitive disadvantage.
If the survival of the business relies entirely on a high density of A players, why are organizations chronically terrible at hiring them?
Because most companies use a fundamentally flawed hiring mechanism known as the black swan trap.
Oh, like the nonprofit story.
Yes. A perfect example of this occurred with a small, regional, nonprofit organization looking for a new executive director. The board of directors spent weeks drafting a job description.
They wanted a candidate who possessed elite operational management skills, a decade of successful high-dollar fundraising experience, deep political connections, and the ability to personally manage complex digital marketing campaigns.
They engineered a profile of a unicorn, a black swan candidate that likely does not exist in reality. And when asked about the compensation package for this mythical titan of industry, the board chair proudly stated their budget was $45,000 a year.
It is pure corporate delusion. A candidate possessing even half of those specific skills would command a massive six-figure salary in the private sector.
By designing an impossible job description paired with an insulting salary, the nonprofit guaranteed they would attract the absolute worst candidates in the market. The only person who will accept that role is someone who has been fired from every other job and is completely desperate.
They confused a fantasy wish list with an actual recruiting strategy. To dismantle this structural failure, leaders must adopt strict, continuous recruiting protocols.
The first rule is that recruiting is not an episodic event triggered by an employee resigning. It is a permanent state of operation.
By mathematical definition, top 15% A players are almost never unemployed. They are not scrolling generic job boards on a Tuesday afternoon. They are currently employed, highly valued, and actively crushing it at a competitor.
Which means you have to be constantly hunting. And that leads to a deeply controversial rule. If a true game-changing A player becomes available or signals they are willing to jump ship, you hire them immediately.
Even if you do not have an open headcount, even if there is a company-wide hiring freeze.
Wait, how do you hire someone during a strict financial freeze?
This is where theory meets brutal reality. The mandate is clear. You identify the lowest performing C player in your current organization, you terminate their employment, and you use their salary to fund the A player.
You constantly trade up.
Exactly. Protecting a mediocre employee just to appease the finance department's spreadsheet is a dereliction of leadership.
And this continuous hunting fundamentally changes the dynamic of the interview. It becomes a dual sales process. When you finally get an A player in the room, you cannot sit back with your arms crossed, acting like a feudal lord demanding they beg for the job.
They have options. They are interviewing you just as aggressively as you are interviewing them. You have to sell them on the vision, the autonomy, and the capital upside.
And setting the baseline standard for this talent acquisition cannot be delegated entirely to human resources. When Marissa Mayer took over as CEO of Yahoo, she instituted a policy that absolutely baffled the industry.
In a company employing roughly 15,000 people, she mandated that she personally review and approve every single new hire. Critics called it the ultimate manifestation of the total control micromanager.
But strategically, it was a massive cultural intervention. Mayer recognized a toxic organizational dynamic B players have a deeply ingrained psychological tendency to hire C players.
A B player is often intimidated by the raw horsepower of an A player. They fear being overshadowed or replaced, so they hire down.
By forcing every resume across her desk, Mayer artificially inserted an A player standard into every single departmental hiring decision, forcing the middle managers to dramatically elevate their targets.
Beyond setting the standard, speed is the ultimate weapon in recruiting. The protocol suggests that the window from identifying a prime candidate to extending a formal written offer should never exceed 2 weeks.
Traditional corporate hiring, with its endless rounds of panel interviews, personality assessments, and administrative delays, often takes months. By the time the massive corporation finally grinds out an offer letter, the agile startup competitor has already hired the A player and onboarded them.
You also have to hunt in asymmetric environments. Stop trying to outbid Google and Meta for computer science grads from Stanford.
There is a massive, untapped reservoir of A players at smaller regional universities who possess the exact same cognitive horsepower and raw hunger, but are completely ignored by the coastal tech monopolies.
You also aggressively target junior military officers. The military subjects 24-year-olds to a crucible of high-stakes, life-or-death leadership development that no corporate training program can possibly replicate. You get disciplined, hyper-adaptable leaders who do not panic under pressure.
But once you source this talent, how do you actually evaluate them in an interview setting? This introduces the classic debate between raw talent and relevant experience.
Bobby Knight provides another foundational paradigm here. During the 1984 NBA draft, the Portland Trail Blazers held the #2 overall pick. The Houston Rockets were locking in Akeem Olajuwon at #1.
Knight calls his close friend Stu Amon, who was the general manager of the Trailblazers. Knight tells him, "You must draft this kid out of North Carolina named Michael Jordan. He's the most talented basketball player I have ever witnessed."
And the GM replies with the ultimate corporate resume-driven objection. He says, "Bobby, we already have an all-star shooting guard in Clyde Drexler. The roster has a glaring hole in the middle. We desperately need a center."
To which Knight famously replies, "Then draft Jordan and play him at center."
It is the ultimate assertion that transcendent talent obliterates positional requirements. Portland ignored the advice. They drafted Sam Bowie, a highly experienced center who perfectly fit the job description they had written.
Bowie's career was derailed by injuries, and Portland missed out on arguably the greatest athlete in modern human history because they prioritized a specific resume over raw, undeniable capability.
In the corporate world, this manifests as the resume snob. This is the hiring manager who excessively filters candidates based on pedigree. If the candidate didn't spend 5 years at McKinsey or Goldman Sachs, they toss the resume in the trash.
They conflate tenure with excellence. But surviving for a decade at a massive bureaucratic tech company does not mean you were actually driving value. It often just means you're exceptionally good at hiding in the corporate machinery.
The operational rule for balancing this is crucial. Prioritize deep, relevant experience when you are hiring executive leaders tasked with building and scaling entirely new departments.
You do not want a brilliant amateur guessing how to architect a global supply chain or structure a 100-person sales commission plan.
However, when you are hiring individual contributors, the frontline engineers, the account executives, the analysts, raw cognitive horsepower, adaptability, and drive will almost always outperform rigid, repetitive experience.
The primary indicator of that raw drive is what we call creative initiative. It is the rarest and most valuable trait in an employee.
There is a story of an executive interviewing a candidate for a high-level administrative role. He asked her to walk him through her previous experience, and she mentions she recently quit her job as a receptionist at a high-end massage parlor.
He asks why she left. She shrugs and says, "Well, once I checked the clients in and they went back into the massage rooms, the lobby was empty, there was nothing for me to do. I was just sitting there for an hour and I got bored."
To an untrained interviewer, that might sound like an employee eager for more action. But the executive recognized it as a massive red flag, indicating a total vacuum of creative initiative.
To a high-performing mindset, an empty lobby isn't a license to be bored. It is an opportunity. A candidate with creative initiative would have spent that hour auditing the appointment books, calling lapsed clients to offer promotions, designing new marketing flyers, or organizing the inventory.
The candidate viewed a job strictly as a passive state of receiving commands.
To successfully screen for creative initiative, you have to completely abandon the gimmicky brain teaser interview questions. For years, companies tried to emulate Google by asking candidates absurd questions like, how many golf balls can fit in a school bus?
Or how many cows are in Canada? Google's own internal data science teams eventually ran a massive longitudinal study and admitted that performance on those brain teasers had absolutely zero statistical correlation with actual job performance. They were worse than useless.
They failed because they tested a candidate's ability to perform parlor tricks under pressure, not their actual operational behavior.
The only statistically valid method is strict behavioral interviewing. You do not ask hypothetical questions about what a candidate thinks they would do in a crisis. You ask highly specific, structured questions about what they actually did in the past.
You ask, walk me through the exact steps you took the last time a major project you were leading was drastically behind schedule. Past behavior, specifically in moments of high friction, is the only reliable predictor of future performance.
But let's confront the darkest reality of leadership. You run the behavioral interview, you check the references, you make the hire, and you get it wrong. The employee is a disaster.
The mechanics of firing are where the true culture of a company is forged. There is a wide spectrum of failure here. On one extreme, you have the chainsaw Al Dunlap approach.
Dunlap was notorious for taking over companies and indiscriminately firing thousands of workers, not as a strategic pivot, but merely as a brutal, short-term mechanism to artificially inflate the quarterly stock price and enrich himself.
It is sociopathic leadership that destroys the underlying capability of the firm. But the polar opposite is far more common and subtly insidious. It is the saint.
This is the leader who places supreme value on workplace harmony and avoiding interpersonal conflict. The saint is physically nauseated by the prospect of a difficult confrontation.
So they allow highly toxic, incompetent C players to remain on the payroll for years, rationalizing it with excuses about giving them another chance or waiting for the right time.
The damage the saint inflicts is profound. A manager once shared a story from his early days overseeing a massive department. He had a direct report who was a statistical nightmare.
She was chronically absent, she manipulated her colleagues into doing her work, and her error rate was disastrous. He compiles an ironclad file documenting her failures and takes it to his boss, requesting immediate termination.
His boss, a classic saint, panics at the idea of firing someone. He forces the manager to put the toxic employee on a tedious 90-day performance improvement plan.
30 days into the plan, the toxic employee walks into the manager's office and announces that she found another job and is resigning immediately.
The manager is ecstatic. The crisis has resolved itself without a messy termination. He runs down the hall to share the victory with his boss.
But the boss has a visceral panic attack. The boss is so terrified of having to go through the bureaucratic nightmare of opening a requisition, interviewing candidates, and training a new hire that he physically runs out to the parking lot, catches the toxic employee before she drives away, and offers her a massive, unbudgeted raise to stay.
The employee ultimately declines the counteroffer, but not before marching back inside and loudly bragging to the entire department that leadership just offered the absolute worst performer on the floor a massive pay increase.
That single action instantly annihilated the morale of the entire department. The A players who had been carrying the toxic employee's workload for months suddenly realized that competence was irrelevant.
The leader demonstrated that he was willing to sacrifice the high performers just to avoid an administrative headache.
It is infuriating. But analyzing termination gets incredibly complex when you apply Jack Welch's framework from GE. Welch evaluated his leadership team on a strict two-axis grid. Did the leader hit their financial performance targets? And did the leader embody the core cultural values of the company?
The extremes of the grid are easy to manage. Type 1 leaders hit their massive revenue targets and deeply embody the core values. You promote them and give them equity.
Type 2 leaders miss their financial targets and violate the core values. You fire them immediately without a second thought.
Type 3 leaders deeply embody the core values, but they miss their financial numbers. You offer them grace, you retrain them, you move them to a role better suited to their skills.
But the Type 4 leader is the ultimate existential threat to a company's integrity. The Type 4 leader is a financial juggernaut. They obliterate their sales quotas. They are responsible for 40% of your quarterly revenue.
But they are a toxic, destructive force who completely violates every core value you claim to hold. They belittle the support staff, they hoard critical information, they take credit for their subordinates' work, and they create a culture of pure fear.
Jack Welch argued with absolute conviction that the Type 4 leader is the most dangerous entity in the corporate ecosystem. You must fire them.
Because if you allow a Type 4 leader to remain in power, you are broadcasting a devastating signal to your entire workforce. You are hanging a giant neon sign in the lobby that says, "Our core values are entirely fraudulent. We will tolerate the emotional abuse of our staff as long as the abuser generates enough cash."
But let's talk about the raw physics of that decision.
Yeah.
It is incredibly easy to sit in a studio and say, fire the toxic high performer to protect the culture.
Right.
In reality, if you fire the woman who brings in 40% of your revenue, you might literally not be able to make payroll next month. You might bankrupt the company to save its soul. That is a terrifying, vertigo-inducing tightrope walk.
It is the ultimate crucible of executive credibility. Yes, the short-term financial hit of terminating a rainmaker is brutal, but the long-term mathematics are undeniable.
A players possess an incredibly low tolerance for toxic environments.
If you protect the abusive rainmaker, your quiet, highly competent A players will simply update their resumes and leave. You will experience a massive talent drain, leaving you completely dependent on the sociopath. Firing the Type 4 leader is often the painful surgery required to save the patient.
But termination isn't the only lever to pull when the financial walls are closing in. There is a magnificent case study from Parrish Medical Center in Florida that redefines how to navigate an economic crisis.
In 2008, the Great Recession hit, and simultaneously the nearby Kennedy Space Center began shutting down the space shuttle program. The regional economy was decimated. The hospital faced a massive multi-million-dollar budget shortfall.
The standard lazy executive playbook in that scenario is the chainsaw owl approach. An immediate, across-the-board 10% reduction in force. You fire 10% of the nurses, the janitors, and the admin staff to instantly balance the spreadsheet.
But the CEO of Parrish Medical Center recognized that mass layoffs destroy trust and degrade patient care. So he chose radical transparency.
He organized massive town hall meetings and presented the raw, terrifying financial data to all 1,000 employees. He didn't shield them. He said, "This is our deficit. If we don't close this gap, we will have to let people go. I am asking you, the experts on the front lines, to find the savings." He treated them like highly capable adults.
And the workforce responded with overwhelming creative initiative. They submitted hundreds of hyper-specific operational adjustments. The surgical teams found ways to reduce supply waste. The facilities teams optimized energy usage.
By tapping into the collective intelligence of the organization, the hospital saved $3.6 million in the first year and over $7 million by 2009.
They didn't just avoid mass layoffs. They actively increased their employee engagement metrics to world-class levels during a macroeconomic collapse.
Because they align the intent with the autonomy. Which brings us to the ultimate synthesis of this deep dive. True leadership is not about reaching some mythical, Zen-like state of perfect balance where you can just sit back and watch the machine hum.
Leadership is the active, exhausting, continuous walk across the tightrope. It is the microscopic, daily adjustments. It is knowing when to drop the hammer on a toxic performer and when to pack candy boxes with the shipping department.
It is the brutal tension between demanding growth and protecting the balance sheet.
It is recognizing that the moment you think you have absolute control over the organization, you are about to fall. Your only true leverage is your influence. And your influence is only as strong as your credibility, your competence, and your demonstrable care for the people executing the vision.
So what does this all mean for you? Whether you run a Fortune 500 company, lead a small project team, or are just managing your own career, applying those 3 C's and evaluating your own 6 hats will give you a distinct competitive advantage. But there is one final, deeply psychological layer to this that we have to unpack.
The source material ends with a story that genuinely shocked me. The author had built a highly successful company, and they were finally acquired by a massive tech conglomerate.
Okay.
As part of the acquisition, he negotiated an incredibly generous severance package for the employees whose roles were being eliminated. We are talking about massive, year-long payouts. He gathers the team, announces the deal, and reveals these life-changing checks.
But instead of cheering, the employees are visibly devastated. They are panicking.
Why on earth are they upset? They essentially just won the corporate lottery.
They were panicking because of the deeply ingrained neurological wiring of the human brain. To understand this, we have to look at the SCARF model of neurosocial research developed by David Rock.
SCARF is an acronym that defines the 5 fundamental domains of human social experience: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness.
The critical revelation of the SCARF model is that the human brain processes social threats in these 5 domains using the exact same neural pathways that it uses to process physical pain or a threat to physical survival.
Walk us through exactly how that maps to the severance package. Let's break down the acronym. S is status, your relative importance to others.
By selling the company, the employees lost their specific titles and their standing in the industry hierarchy.
SKI is certainty, being able to predict the future. Even with money in the bank, they had no idea what they would be doing next Tuesday.
A is autonomy, a sense of control over events. They had no say in the sale of the company. It was forced upon them.
Round is relatedness, a sense of safety with others, the feeling of belonging to a tribe. The sale permanently disbanded their tight-knit team.
And F is fairness, the perception of equitable exchange.
So even though the CEO provided massive financial certainty with the severance checks, the acquisition completely annihilated their status, their autonomy, and most importantly, their relatedness.
Precisely. To the primitive limbic system of the brain, being suddenly severed from your tribe and losing your daily purpose triggers a massive, screaming threat response.
The primal terror of social exclusion and loss of status completely short-circuited the logical reward response of the cash.
That is a terrifying reality for any leader to internalize. It means you can do everything perfectly on a spreadsheet, you can hit the rule of 45, you can balance the budget, you can hand out massive bonuses, and still completely traumatize your workforce if you ignore the neurochemistry of social dynamics.
It demands continuous, rigorous self-audit. Every time you send an email, announce a policy shift, or walk into a meeting, you must ask yourself, am I triggering a threat response in my team's GARF domains, or am I triggering a reward response?
Because all the brilliant strategy and perfectly balanced budgets in the world will evaporate if your team's brains are subconsciously convinced they are under attack from their own leadership.
That is an incredible lens to view your daily interactions through. We started this deep dive talking about the clarity of an X-ray, how in the medical world, a broken arm presents as a stark, white, binary line. It is visible, it is fixable, and it is comforting in its simplicity.
But the architecture of human organizations offers no such clarity. There is no simple diagnostic imaging for a toxic culture or a flawed strategy.
There isn't. You are permanently operating in the murky, chaotic reality of the leadership tightrope.
You're suspended high above the ground, tasked with moving a massive, complex system toward a constantly shifting horizon, utilizing nothing but the fragile currency of your own influence.
But if you relentlessly guard your credibility, if you force yourself to wear the right hats, if you continuously hunt for top-tier talent, and if you respect the deeply human psychology of the people walking the wire with you, who just might make it to the other side.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.